So, lunch, right? We'll get there. So, my name is Karl Fast. I'm a professor right now at Kent State University. I teach information architecture and a lot of other things in the user experience program that we have there. I used to be an information architect at Argus back in the day. I liked it so much, I married one of these people. If you're not sure who it is, I married the smart one. This is the two basic books, right? They're published around here, and if we're going to talk about the future, I think we should figure out what we mean by the future. When is the future? When I was a kid, the future was always the year 2000, right? And every year, the future got 1 year closer. So, what should we think of as being the future? I'm going to say 2100. Let's just roll it out roughly about 100 years in the future and talk about what problems will IA be grappling with when I'm dead. This is a nice thing because when I'm dead, if I'm wrong, it doesn't really matter. But I think it's worth stretching our minds beyond what we can reasonably answer here. Beyond the work that we do right now, beyond our obsessions with mobile first, beyond our obsession with what screen resolution do I want to deal with, or all of the new browser technology, or multi-touch, or whatever it happens to be. Let's try to push a little bit further and try to identify some things, because one of the great things about the Polar Bear book and the information architecture book is they identify important things that will still be relevant and important in 100 years from now. Organization, navigation, labeling, and biggest of all, understanding. And I think that's really Werman's greatest insight here. Much of his work really doesn't exhibit a great understanding about links, computation, right? It's still very much about a person creating a thing for one other person to do individually. There's many things that are not present in that vision, but understanding is there, and that's still the key thing in my view. And when it comes to the Polar Bear book, we add this idea of links and nodes and search. But even that has some limitations, and I think we want to try to push past that a little bit. And we want to figure out what branch of the evolutionary tree do we want to pour our energies into, right? Because there's a lot of branches here, and some of them are going to be dead ends, and a lot of them are going to be taken over by technology. What can we be doing at that point, 100 years from now? So, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we have this problem that we like to talk about called information overload, which I think is the wrong way to talk about it, right? But let me give you, just in case you're not deeply aware of how serious it is or what a big thing it is, right? Facebook now has over 250 million photos uploaded every single day. They're getting close to 2 billion photos a week. And what's really interesting about this is that photos is not their core mission. Right? The largest digital photo repository in the world, and it's a peripheral thing from their core mission. Google now does over 2 million searches a minute, and YouTube is now getting an hour of video every second. We're at a point where these numbers no longer resonate with us. We can't really make sense of them. We're not talking about grains of beach on a sand. We're not talking about grains of sand on a beach. We're not talking about grains of sand on all the beaches in all the world. We're talking about 10 times that this year. It really truly boggles the mind to a point where we as human beings are not cognitively capable of understanding what it really means. We don't know anymore. It's just big. But this is a problem that we've always wanted to achieve, right? We have always wanted information. We go back to clay tablets to today. This is the path that we chose. So to call it information overload, I think, is a grave mistake. And we've got to this situation where we use the phrase information overload, and so in a way we've succeeded, mission accomplished, right? And yet there's a large swath of society, right? Nicholas Carr and The Shallows, right? His book The Shallows on how the internet is making us stupid, arguing that this is a problem, that this is a negative thing. But we've always wanted to do this. Right? So this is the basic curve. Except this is not the basic curve. This is the curve. We haven't seen just this massive explosion in information. It's been combined with a massive explosion in computation, and with devices, and with people who are using all of these things. What happens when we think about all of these together? Now think about this. Google launches their translation tool, right? English to Chinese. They enter it into a competition. They win the competition for the single best piece of software to translate English and Chinese back and forth. Amazing fact, no one on the team knows Chinese. Not a single person speaks Chinese. How did they do it? Information and computation. Plus people creating all that information. It's all of this stuff and a massive number of devices to tie all this together, right? It's a big cluster. It's not a computer. How do we deal with this? Right now, we've basically come up with, I think, 3 major solutions. One is the information architecture path, which I'm just going to simply and lightly call deliberate structure. I'm just going to sum it up. We create structure for other people, which they need to encounter and they need to deal with. The second approach is what I'll call the Google approach, which is algorithms plus computation, right? Massive computation. And the third approach is coordinated group action, which we could call the Wikipedia approach. Is that all? Certainly, it's got us a long ways. Can it get us to 2100? Probably, in some ways. But what about some of the things that are there some other things? And I want to suggest 3. I want to suggest 3 themes that are particularly important, which actually come back to a question that Peter raised here, which is what can't be automated, what can't be outsourced. Things which relate to, I think, one of probably the most encouraging trend within information architecture is this understanding about experience, right? And user experience as a bigger picture. So my first theme here is deep interaction. And by deep interaction, I don't mean just touch. I don't just mean your smartphone. As I've been speaking here, I have been talking with my hands. Why have I been talking with my hands? Why have I done this? Why do we all do this? Well, the standard answer here is that it's extra information. The same way as when I raise my voice or pause. It adds things to the words. So why then do we talk with our hands when we're on the phone? Well, the answer there, you might say, is it's a learned behavior. I'm used to talking with other people, so therefore, when they're not present, I continue to talk with my hands. Good answer. Why do people who are blind talk with their hands? Turns out they do. Not only do people who are blind talk with their hands, but they talk with their hands when they are talking to other people who are blind. 2 people who can't see a hand talking with their hands. In studies of this, and there's a large body of research in cognitive psychology about this, they've done various enormous numbers of studies, and things like asking people who are sighted and who are blind to do some particular problem-solving task, reason through it, and then explain what they did and explain their answer and what they found. And not only do, whether you're sighted or blind, both groups of people not only use gestures and hand gestures to communicate and explain what they're talking about, but they use very similar gestures. The general conclusion from all of this research is that there is a deep connection between mind and body, and that the actual act of gesturing, and I don't mean symbols here like okay or thumbs up, I mean these sort of random or seemingly random gestures that co-occur with speech, that it's a deep part of how we think. It actually shapes our thoughts, and to not use our hands actually constrains our thinking. Now, I'm pointing to a large body of academic work here, generally in the area of embodiment or embodied cognition. And the basic idea here is that Descartes was wrong, that mind-body separation is a useful construct only so far, and it doesn't actually reflect the way we think, the way we understand the world. Which is kind of interesting considering traditional notions within things like human-computer interaction about how people are. This is a paper on called the Epic Architecture for Cognition and Performance with Application to Human-Computer Interaction. If you look back at the history, I think much of human-computer interaction has this deep, deep idea that the computer and our minds are basically the same. Our minds do computation, but more importantly, that our body is just an output, and that our eyes and perceptual and our senses are just inputs. Action is just this little thing. Cognition is a big piece, and the world is a big piece, but perception and action, those are just inputs and outputs. The embodied cognition perspective here is arguing that that's a really limited view. That's basically what it comes down to. And there's a key idea here in the extreme form, what's called the extended mind hypothesis, something called the parity principle, which is that if a process works in a way that if it was done in your head, you would say, well, that's a cognitive process, then if we do it in the world, it should also count as a cognitive process. And in the extreme form of this, they would argue that when you're using your iPhone, it is not like metaphorically an extension of your mind. It is literally an extension of your mind. Now, you may be thinking, that's kind of crazy. And I think it's at least a little bit crazy. But I find it to be a very interesting argument, and what I most find is imagine that it's a spectrum, where on the one side we have this idea of mind and body being completely separate, and on the other hand we have this idea that mind and body are completely integrated and totally connected with the world around them. Where are we on this spectrum right now in terms of our assumptions for when we do our design? We're over here. And we don't need to go all the way over to this side to buy into the full-blown parity principle extended mind hypothesis here, but I think we need to shuffle over this way. For after all, what are you doing when you stand at the board with the Post-its? Do you stand there and put your hands behind your back and look and stare and think? You don't. You pick up the pieces and you move them around. The interaction, that deep interaction with the information, with the environment, with the people, that is where the understanding comes from. We do this as part of our work. So that's number one, deep interaction. Number two, I think, is what I'm going to call coordination. We might use another word like orchestration. There was a time when information meant having a notebook and a pen. There was a time when it meant a computer, like this. And what I like about this picture in particular is this idea that it's just there. There's nothing else, right? I have a single thing that I am dealing with. I have in my office 2 computers, a total of 5 monitors, plus 2 laptops. I also have a tablet. I have 1 other laptop. I have 2 machines in my lab with multi-touch surfaces. How many devices do you have, right? And it's been years since I've had only 1 computer, probably 93, 94. I don't think I've had less than 6 ever since then. And now I just have many more. And I don't have a smartphone, right? I have a cheap pay-as-you-go phone that costs me $50 a year. I use it for coordinating family stuff because I live a very different life. I don't need a smartphone. Would like one. I'm not willing to pay for it. But what I do see is everywhere we're coordinating stuff. And it's not just coordinating digital across digital. It's coordinating my information through paper, through physical media, through spaces. In many ways, I feel like we need, as Peter mentioned, new terms. And a new word that I've been using is something called things. I mentioned that we've got computation and information and devices and people. Well, the first 3 of those, computation, information, and devices, are now things that we used to think of as separate concepts, but they're so embedded together that I want to stop talking about those as separate things and talking about them as something new, something that combines all of those. And so the tentative word I have right now is what I call a thing, right? Physical, haptic, interactive, information-rich, networked, and next-generation stuff on surfaces, which is not necessarily the best acronym, but it kind of hopefully gets you a little bit more in that direction. And I think this idea that Peter has about new language is precisely right. And of course, we coordinate a lot more than just information. We coordinate people, we coordinate activities, we coordinate experiences. We can coordinate this through information, through devices, through things. My last one is mess. This is one of the iconic images of Steve Jobs. Right? It appeared in Time magazine when the Macintosh was first launched in 1984. This was the genius at work. Right? This was the image that we were given. This was him in his house. He was so picky he couldn't buy furniture. He only had one lamp. Right? This idea of minimalism, of this minimalist aesthetic, is something that we see resonated throughout everything that Apple creates. This is my favorite picture of Steve Jobs. This is his home office. Do you notice anything? What you notice is that this is a lie. Right? This is a facade. This is the way we want the world to be. We think that this is the way the world should be, but this is mess. This is the soul of creativity. Now, a lot of our desktops look like this, so if you think it's just about the physical world, I think you're quite wrong. I've seen desktops like this this is what the desktops of some faculty members where I teach work, and I'm talking about people who are in information science, right? Doesn't apply to you? Let's think. Tell me about your email box. Tell me about your Evernote collection. Tell me about Instapaper. Tell me about your browser bookmarks. Tell me about the files in your hard drive, right? Mess is everywhere, and we don't have any way of accounting for it, except one, which is to say it's bad. It's wrong. It should be banished. It's unnatural. It seems to me that mess is a fundamental part of reality, and we don't have a way of describing it. Those other two things that I mentioned, coordination and deep interaction, are completely tied up in this idea of mess. In 2100, I think we need to have a much better understanding of that. We need to have a much better understanding of why we think the top picture here is better than the bottom picture, even when the bottom picture reflects much of our reality. So those are my three themes. I have others, but those are the three I chose for today: deep interaction, coordination, and mess. Because when it gets down to it, the thing about information abundance is that information is cheap, but understanding is expensive, and we have not figured that out. Now, my brother, one of my brothers, is a biologist. He studies Arctic waterfowl ecology, which is basically ducks in cold places. We are both academics, both scholars. At least that's what the university says I'm supposed to be doing. We live in two very different worlds. He lives in the world on the left. He lives in the world of the leaf. He lives in the world as it is. That is the world that he is trying to understand. He does not live in the world over there, the digital world, the information world, the world of information, devices, computation, that big explosion. That is not the world as it is, though. That is the world as it may be. To me, that is the big divide. Understanding the world as it is, or understanding the world as it may be, And that, to me, is what information architecture is about. We're particularly interested in the world as it may be where it relates to information and computation, especially information and understanding. More broadly, we're concerned with experience. I think that's a great thing to be in for the next 100 years. Thank you. What do we have for time here?
So I'm a little terrified of the kinds of questions you folks might ask after those two talks, but we got 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll go for lunch. So now's your chance to ask Karl some really difficult questions.
Yes. So much of the stuff that we have here, we've been talking about this idea, coming back to Werman, about understanding, right? And that information architects are people who create understanding in the world. And one thing that I didn't mention here, and that I think is a really big question, is there's a deep-seated assumption that we can actually know the world, that we can understand the world. And I don't think that that's actually true. I think there are some very serious limits in terms of what we are capable of as human beings. So let me give you an example. There's a piece of software that's been written by some people, I think at Cornell. It's called Eureka with a Q. And the idea is when you've got a very large, massive, complicated data set, like you might get in biology, what you do is you can't figure out how to model it. You can't come up with any equations to explain it. What you do is you take your data and you just basically dump it into Eureka, and it tries some equations and tries some more equations and tries some more equations and keeps iterating until it finds equations which describe your data. So there are scientists now, biology is an excellent example, where they are dealing with their very large data sets to try to model it, not by creating a model of it, by dumping into this program which spits out these equations, and then they look at these equations and they say, I don't know how that works. It does. The analogy that one of the scientists said was it's kind of like Einstein dreamed E equals mc squared, and then said, it seems to work, but I don't actually know what C is. And that's, I think, something that is going to become a bigger issue for us. We're sort of always going on the assumption that we can make the world understandable with all of this huge amounts of data, and I'm not sure that that's actually true. Which is somewhat frightening, I think, right? So, but I think that's a big trend. There's two books that I would really recommend reading about this right now. One is called Reinventing Discovery by Michael Nielsen. He's a physicist and theoretical physicist who works in quantum computation. And there's another book that's some of you may have heard of. It's called Too Big to Know. It's by David Weinberger. And he's talking about what happens, the world has always been too big to know. But we're now much more coming to terms with that. And we're having to change how we do things. And he's arguing that knowledge itself and the shape of knowledge is changing itself. So I think those are big directions for all of this. Those are two books worth taking a look at.
And I don't have anything intelligent to say on that topic, but I wanted to just riff off of one of Karl's points. I thought was a really brilliant thing to bring up was this weird kind of bidirectional kind of, again, intertwinkled relationship between mind and body, and it just made me think that one of the things that I've been doing differently over the last 5 years that I found really helpful is I started using one of these, right? Not the actual World IA Day one, but one of the best ways to think, right, is to be sketching ideas, jotting notes with a pencil. And it's not high tech, but in terms of being creative, in terms of coming up with new ideas, I think it's a wonderful example of that loop between what happens in the mind and what happens out in the world and how they influence one another.
That actually represents to me one of the biggest shifts we've had over the last decade or so. When I started in this field, I think if there was a mantra that you were going to give to anyone as advice, right, the one thing that you should always be doing, it was always be like talking to users, always be observing users, always be connecting with users in some way. And now I think it's always be sketching, by which we mean always be exploring the design space, because the design space is huge and you can't go very easily from A to B.
And here's just, I'll take a question in 1 second, but here's just another sort of thought that popped into my mind. It has nothing to do with the topic, really. But I was just, as Karl and I are switching back and forth between the microphone, I was remembering at one of the early internet conferences where Jacob Nielsen and Don Norman were up on the stage on a panel, and they each had their own microphones. And one of the problems was that one of the microphones broke. So they had to share a microphone. And Don and Jacob were literally fighting over the microphone. It was a lot of fun to watch. But anyway, back to questions. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question, a difficult one. I'm honestly not sure that you can. And so what you have to do is find ways to affect the kinds of changes you want to see without counting on getting them all giddy about, these geeky topics. And the thing that kind of came across my mind as you were asking that question was this. So how do you take all of these kinds of exciting ideas and make them happen in the real world? And what I find is kind of a strange phenomenon is very often there's a split between what I'm writing and speaking about and what I'm actually doing in my consulting life. And sometimes that split gets pretty wide. When I wrote Ambient Findability, it was kind of painful because I'm thinking into the future about where things are going, and then in the daytime I'm just doing totally regular, normal stuff. And it was very uncomfortable for a while. What I see is that it will surprise you if you take yourself into that kind of more futuristic space, or you start to imagine things and write and talk about them. You'll eventually end up doing them, right? There's some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that happens there. You're more attuned to those kinds of opportunities. And so I would encourage you to write about those topics, to speak about them, and to just keep an eye out for opportunities where a project that might look boring on the surface actually has a way for you to sneak in this new idea that the executives might not be excited about. They might not even let you do it if they knew what you were really doing. But the organization and its customers or users will benefit from it over the long term.
Yeah, I'm too far out of the consulting world to have a really wise answer to that, but I have found that people within our field find the big picture and some of the abstract ideas here about that future interesting and exciting, and other people find it either confusing or terrifying. And my parents, and I think this is true for many of you, who still don't understand what I do, no matter how many times I explain it to them, even in the most simple terms. And but if I had to make one small piece of advice, it would be grandchildren. people who are in senior positions have children and grandchildren, and when they see them doing something, then that's usually if they're willing to make decisions based on that. I mean, you need to make it more concrete for them in some way, and those are that's one technique. But I really don't know exactly how to convince them. It's a big problem in the whole world, right? You know, there's the Stuart Brand, to come back to him. He had the Long Now Foundation, and the idea with the Long Now Foundation was how do we get people, like especially business leaders and government leaders and the big decision makers, to think beyond the next quarter or the next election, right? Like that's a huge problem. And it's not something that I think we can totally address. I think it's a cultural problem.
So we don't want to be between you guys and lunch. How about maybe one more question if there is one, and then we'll break for lunch? Was there? Yeah, and right there, sure.
I think the example I didn't give here is to basically think about what people are doing when they're doing an interaction, when they're doing some interaction. I'm interested generally in what I think of as a very small scale interaction as opposed to a bigger, broader interaction. And one of the things we know is that, so there's a famous paper from about almost 20 years ago now on how people play Tetris. And what they were trying to do was they were saying, well, how do people learn how to play Tetris? And Tetris is a very simple game, right? You have blocks and they fall down, and you can move them left, you can move them right, or you can rotate them into position, and then you drop them down. And so they did a very careful keystroke analysis of how people learn to play Tetris. And what they predicted was, well, as you're a beginner, you make mistakes, right? So you move it too far left or you move it too far right. And in particular, you rotate it, and then you rotate it one turn too far, and you have to keep going back. So you have this over-rotation. And their prediction, based on classical theories and cognitive science, was, well, as you become more experienced and as you become a better player, those over-rotations will decrease. And they found that that was not the case. That better players who have both more skill and more experience over-rotate. They deliberately over-rotate, and so they sought an explanation as to why. Their explanation was to make a distinction between two different types of ways that people interact with the world. One was what they called pragmatic action. And the idea in pragmatic action was every step that you take in the world, everything that you do is about moving to some desired goal in the world. So if I want to drink a glass of water, if I'm moving over here, I'm taking pragmatic action, I'm moving towards that glass. If I'm moving over here, I'm obviously making a mistake and I'm not heading towards that direction. So that's the problem. And that they also argued that that when people were doing those over-rotations, they weren't doing it to achieve that goal. They were doing it because they wanted more information. Because what they found was it was actually faster. Their very careful study showed that it was actually faster for people to rotate a block in the world than to rotate it in their head. So they changed the world, not to change the world, but to get information. So they called this epistemic action, to make mental computation simpler or faster, or to reduce the chance of making another larger mistake. And I think that with a lot of studies, with a lot of observational studies of people, one of the default views that we have is we look at every single step that they have and we think, well, how can we minimize that? There must be a bunch of extraneous things that they are doing here which we can chop out. Oh, they clicked on that, right? You're doing a click test. And people click on a certain level of the hierarchy, and then they go back up, and then they go down to the right one. And we think, well, that must be a mistake because they didn't follow the optimal path here. But in doing that, going down some other path, they're getting information about the information space. So I think that when it comes to part of that embodiment, there's this idea that what people are doing in the world, like with the using of their hands, that this is not necessarily fluff that we as designers should be stripping away, that we should be working to eliminate. We should be trying to understand how that is part of helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve. So that's one answer that I have on that.
So I'm sure you're all starving. We're going to let you move towards your desired goal of lunch, and I would recommend you do not over-rotate.
Yes.
Thank you.
One thing that Dan had to step out, but he wanted me to remind everybody to be back here for 1:30. 1:30.
Nice job. Fascinating.
Yours was good. There was a couple of things I was making mental notes at quite a few places about things I wanted to try to refer back to. You know, I actually dislike the term cross-channel.
Yeah.
It comes from like sales and reinventing discovery by Michael Nielsen. Partly because I think it comes from like sales and like supply chain management and things like that.
Yeah.
And I like coordination as a.
Right.
It's essentially it's
Right.
a similar kind of term, right?
Hi. Sure.
Yeah. Just the two of us here, or all right, that'd be great.
Pop a button on here.
Yeah. So I didn't know that about your report for the Library of Congress. That's a good story.